Geoff Raby was Australia's ambassador to China from 2007 to 2011 and is currently an international business consultant based in Beijing. He recently wrote an article in which he expressed concerns about the worsening relationship between Australia and China. He pins the blame on the Australian intelligence establishment, accusing them of ideological politics that longs for a return of U.S. preeminence. As a result, he says, those in his country who favor a more constructive approach have come under attack. To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by the author, Mr. Geoff Raby himself. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you.
Tell me briefly the background against which you wrote this article.
Background was and is still a worsening in the relationship between Australia and China. It's been going down now for all of the past year, but particularly in the course of this year. There have been various factors that have caused it, and there's been some misunderstandings on both sides, but unquestionably this is the lowest ebb in the bilateral relationship for at least 30 years.
You know, as Chinese observers may have pointed out, Australians seem to have lost a sense of a direction. For example, your Prime Minister had a very bad, if not nasty, conversation on the phone with newly elected President Donald Trump, talking about whatever, trade. On the other hand, your relationship declines with the PRC. So what does Australia really follow?
Well, Australia is in a very challenging position internationally at this time. Unquestionably, its security is based on its relationship with the United States, and that's very strong, and that is not going to change. At the same time, Australia is utterly economically dependent on China, and China's rise and emergence as a leading nation in the world has changed the international order. Now, Australia was extremely comfortable in the old order that was led by the United States, in the course of which they're prosecuting a liberal internationalist agenda. That's gone, it's finished. So the unipolar moment is over. We are now entering a new order. I don't think the new order will be bipolar, China and the United States. But in this emerging order, Australia is having great difficulty in finding its position and how to position itself between the United States, China and other emerging powers.
As a senior diplomat and a veteran, if not experienced businessman in China, what are your suggestions on the basic principles which may help us manage the crisis as this boat of the bilateral relationships is being rocked by the choppy waters, uncharted waters? So what are the principles?
I think the principles were laid down some 8 years ago when we had another difficult time in the relationship. I was ambassador at that time. It wasn't anywhere near at a low ebb, such a low ebb as it is today. But in 2009, then Senior Vice Premier Li Keqiang went to Australia and sat down with then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, and they worked on a joint document to set out the principles for managing the relationship. They can be summarised really quite simply, Yang Ray, in terms of recognising that we have two very different political systems. We subscribe to different values, but we have enormous things in common. So let's be upfront and clear about our differences, but don't let those differences get in the way of the huge area of common interest where we can do things together and that work to our mutual benefit. That was essentially the basis of the document that then Vice Premier Li Keqiang and Premier Kevin Rudd agreed on, and I think it would help if we return back to those principles.
And do you think these are the principles of a constructive realism, something that the Kevin Rudd stood for?
Yes, I agree, and I think that is the only way Australia can deal with its relationship with China in terms of constructive realism. Fully support that, and I think, as I said in my article, there's been an infusion, if you like, of ideology into how we manage the relationship and a move away from constructive realism.
Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia, became a very controversial figure. On the one hand, he would not change his basic position on the universal values that Australia stands for and your reliance on the United States for the security. On the other hand, as you said wisely, the future of the Australian economy depends completely on the resilience and dynamics of the Chinese economy. So obviously he would look like someone who's very practical, and the Chinese don't like this idea or image of a optimistic politician, quote unquote. That's what they say about Kevin Rudd. He used to be your boss. And looking back in your review about his image and implications for the future of our bilateral relationship, what would you say?
Look, I think he reflected the dilemma that Australia faces, but that is the reality for us. We have to manage
simply because he speaks Mandarin?
Well, look, but it's really about managing the if you like, the pressure we're under with an emerging China or an emerged China, a changed international order, a United States that's trying to reposition itself in that order, and yet we have this enduring security relationship with the United States. The Australian people demand it. It will not go away. But we have, through natural economic forces, this extraordinary economic interdependence with China. So any Prime Minister has to balance those things. And again, I return to the principles of recognising differences, but focusing on areas of common interest.
The issue, Geoff, is how much is your foreign policy towards China driven by domestic ideology? How much driven by geo-economic and political situations?
Very interesting question, because we have a saying in Canberra in politics that there are no votes in foreign policy. Come an election, a government's not going to stand or fall because of its foreign policy positions. But its management of foreign policy issues is a very important test for the character of the government and its confidence, and to create a sense amongst the Australian community that it knows what it's doing.
What do you mean by character of the government?
Well, character, whether it will stand up for Australia's interests, articulate those interests clearly, be seen to be very focused on the security of the Australian people, but also that it knows what it's doing. So when every day in foreign policy some complex challenge is thrown up, the government responds to it with a very sure-footed way. So no votes, but very important in how people think and feel about a government or a political party.
Geoff, in your article you were very critical of the intelligence community in your country. Now, to my knowledge, intelligence community is very much like the militaries, would adopt a very skeptical, if not hostile, attitudes towards their competitors or enemies in what is called a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, do you think your intelligence community is also held hostage by this ideology, geopolitical conspiracy theories? The understatement or point of my question, Geoff, is whether China should be viewed as a threat to your national security, whether China's rise is or carries overtones of regional and global impact negatively.
Absolutely. Look, it's not just intelligence. What I was talking about, and I said very clearly in the article, it's the Australian security establishment, as I've termed it. So it's military, it's intelligence, it's think tanks that are funded by the Department of Defence, and it's also areas inside government that work on these matters. What has happened is that they have decided that Australia-China relations and foreign policy is too important to be left with the Foreign Ministry. So the Australian security establishment is now in the lead in shaping and formulating Australian foreign policy with respect to China. So what does this mean? Well, it means that we deal with China today, we never used to, we deal with China today on the basis of strategic mistrust. And I think that's a very... Mistrust. And I think that's a very poor foundation. So when China comes to Australia with an idea, say like One Belt, One Road, and says, look, we'd like Australia to participate in this, then the immediate reaction in Canberra is, what's the agenda? What's going on here? Is this a Chinese attempt to establish a Sino-centric order on the world? And then there's pushback. from Beijing's perspective, they see this pushback and they say, but, you know, we're just proposing an idea, we're asking Australia if they want to participate, and so the mistrust becomes on both sides. And I fear that is the situation we've got ourselves into now.
And I believe opinions in your country are divided. For example, on the issue of whether China should be granted more recognition as a rising major power. We used to be weak. We used to be such a weak economy that the United States has adopted a policy of engagement since day one of our modernization campaign over the past 4 decades. Today, do you think you're going to reverse this policy of engagement, seeing you are strong enough to be a threat instead of a blessing for the prosperity of commerce as well as security of the world, particularly that of the Western countries?
Well, there is that debate going on, but I cannot see how a sensible, rational policy would try and step away from engaging China. What is the alternative? We're not going to contain China. No one wants to have conflict. So if those alternatives are ruled out, you only have engagement, and I think we have to be better at engaging.
But you were talking about the South China Sea, where we have the choppy waters for both the growing military presence of the Chinese Blue Water Navy, for example, our deployment of the missiles on the newly built islands. The United States refused to call them islands because of the enlargement, man-made enlargement of the islands. And so Australians and even Indians for a while, now they may have changed their mind, agreed to join the patrol in South China Sea. Don't you think in doing that you're going to run the risk of having serious conflicts with the PRA armed forces?
Yeah, no, absolutely there's risk of conflict, and that's why there's a debate in countries like Australia whether we should be doing that.
Exactly. Once such a conflict were to take place between the two militaries, the United States and China, which side would Australia take?
Well, that's a hypothetical, and we have a treaty security alliance with the United States called the ANZUS Treaty. Whether that's invoked or not will depend on the very specific details of the incident. It's not just a blanket commitment. It will depend on the details of the case in point. I think, though, frankly, given the relative difference in power between the US and the Chinese militaries, China will do everything it can to avoid conflict. And so it should, and I think that's in everyone's interest.
Waters in the Pacific Ocean is not only choppy but murky. Looking at your relationship with the Japanese government, and that gives rise to more suspicions and questions than a clear answer. For example, the previous government went as far as to describe the Japanese behavior in the Second World War as something good. That caused an uproar for the Chinese. We were shocked by Prime Minister Abbott in praising, when he was praising the behavior of Japanese troops. What was behind his remarks?
Well, Prime Minister Abbott's no longer Prime Minister. He did a number of odd things when he was Prime Minister. But I need to be very careful. This is a very sensitive subject. What he said was that we acknowledge the bravery of Japanese troops, specifically in the context of the Japanese troops that sailed midget submarines into Sydney Harbour and sank ships in Sydney Harbour. Don't forget, Australia was attacked by Japan, and Darwin was bombed heavily by Japanese forces, and our soldiers, including my uncle, fought against the Japanese in the jungles in Papua New Guinea for many, many years. What Abbott was doing, though, was, I think, being loose in his praise of Japan because he was infatuated with his new relationship with Prime Minister Abe. Prime Minister Abe was in the country, and Abbott wanted to be saying very positive things to Abe, and this came out in this particular way, but clearly did cause offence in China, and also it offended the Australian returned servicemen from the Second World War, and Abbott had to be put in his place by the Returned Servicemen's League. So it was something that got a very negative reaction in Australia as well.
Thank you so much. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Geoff Raby, former Australian ambassador to China, but currently he does international business consultation based in Beijing. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Back. Would you be called a Panda Hugger as a result of the critical stuff that denounced might be a bit too strong wording in your critical review of the policy behavior of the Australian government?
Yeah, I'm called a Panda Hugger in Clive Hamilton's new book about Chinese influence in Australia. Mm-hmm. I don't mind. I think it's a shame when policy discussions reduce to invective, but that's partly the level of debate, and I think one has to just try and be objective about this. What's disappointing is when one does try and put these issues into a broader context and be objective, one is subject to invective, like being a Panda Hugger, but I can't do anything about it. It's a free country.
I cannot tell you the name of my friend in the academic circle in Beijing. However, a couple of years back, he said, "Yang Rui, you know, there is a very interesting thing about the academic research in China, particularly about international studies. The more you look at the target country, like the United States and Japan, scholars would privately develop a mixed feeling, to say it in one way, to say it in another way. The more you study the target country, the more you like it." Now, you have stayed in China for a number of years. Does the stay here, or is it long enough for you to have developed very profound understanding about this old culture, civilization state, to such a degree where you would easily raise questions about the ideological stereotypes against China and the political bias against this country in the world that is increasingly characterized by a new world war, a new Cold War?
I hope the answer is yes. I mean, really, my capacity and ability to understand and talk about China needs to be judged by others, not by me. But look, I came here in 1986 as a young economist in the embassy, the first economist posted by the foreign ministry overseas anywhere in the world. We didn't do that in those days. And so I've basically lived with much of the 40 years of China's economic reform and open door policy. And I was always an optimist about China, but I could never ever imagine in my most optimistic moments China being like it is today. And so, yes, I am close to China, but I think I've been here long enough to know its strengths and weaknesses, and I'm certainly happy to advise on those. But the achievements of China have been extraordinary, and that has to be recognised in other countries' relations with China and in their foreign policy. But yes, I mean, China is a very complex thing for foreigners to understand. There's no doubt about that.
The rest of the world is watching out, holding their breath about whether China will live up to the expectations to assume the world leadership since the keynote presentation that President Xi Jinping delivered in the Winter Davos about our support for globalization and free trade. But most of them would ask the same question: is China ready? Now, do you share their concerns?
Well, first of all, I don't see a unipolar world returning. So China is not going to be, in and of itself, the world leader. We have moved from the unipolar moment of the US and its liberal internationalist agenda. The new world order will have more countries leading it. Clearly, the US and China will be extremely important elements, but India has a role. Russia, of course, is working hard to have a role. Europe, Turkey, Iran, Indonesia. So it's going to be a very different world order, and it's going to be one where there are many authoritarian states shaping that order.
And Geoff, do you think the United States is the only country and the military that can seriously disrupt China's peaceful rise as a major power? Because China says, look, we are so close to the center stage, we are so close to the rejuvenation of Chinese culture and resumption of our past glories. The United States comes across as the biggest threat. The United States argues the other way around. They say China is our biggest threat. What do you think of this sort of concern?
Well, this goes back to your point about the inevitability. we have to avoid this thing called the Thucydides trap, where an ascendant power feels challenged by the rising power and the conflict's inevitable. Now, some scholars argue that, but a close study of history is not on their side. However, everyone, including countries like Australia, which are friendly both to the United States and to China, we all have to work in trying to find a way to give China ample strategic space whilst maintaining a stable, peaceful world order. That now is the great challenge of our day, and it behoves all of us to debate it, to think about it, and for governments to act accordingly. So, look, the US has unchallenged military power, and that's going to be the case for 20, 30, 40 years. So, from a Chinese perspective, conflict has to be unthinkable, but it's also unthinkable from the US perspective. The immense damage that would do to the United States would not be worth contemplating. So, we are in a world where practically, realistically, inevitably, we are going to have to find a way to accommodate China's rise, to find ample strategic space, but to reflect the interests of other countries as well.
The Pacific Ocean is big enough to accommodate the rise of China in a peaceful way. However, the West, including Australia, would love to see China behave in a way that follows the rules that were set forth by the West decades ago. But China says, you know, the world order needs to be changed. It doesn't mean China wants to replace the world order with their own version. It does mean some of the regulations that cannot live up to the humble demands of China one way or another. They need to be reconsidered. For example, the dominance of US dollars. We want to use more of RMB in our settlements of the trade and major transactions. And do you believe in doing that the hegemonic nature of US dollars will be seriously challenged? Does it amount automatically to our global ambitions?
I think, you know, that's not the best example. I say that because markets will drive the use of currencies ultimately, and the RMB is still a very small share of global international settlements. But you raise a really important point, and that is, and you see it, for example, in the case of the international financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. China for years and years and years asked and wanted the arrangements in those banks to be changed, voting power in particular, to reflect China's weight in the world. And it's perfectly reasonable, and it's the right thing to have done. In the end, China went off and created the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, a new piece of world architecture, one of the first pieces, or the first piece, since the WTO was created in 1995. China's a good member of the WTO as well. China has the right, has a great power to change international arrangements, and the way it's done with the AIB is very encouraging. It could have done all those actions itself unilaterally. Instead, it chose voluntarily to tie itself up in a set of multilateral rules and disciplines. And this is what a future leader of the world order should be doing.
One issue in dispute between the United States, the West and China is how we look at the importance of a state capitalism, quote unquote. We don't have the full liberal market economy which fully respects the market forces in reallocating resources. Yep. Now, China would, always emphasize on the importance, even on the pivotal role of central planning, the government's role in designing the five-year plans and industrial policies. The United States says, no, that's unfair. According to regulations of the WTO, by the way, we are denied still by the European Union, the United States, and other major economies as the full status of the market economy. Having said this, what do you think of the necessity of giving a fair recognition to the role that the government plays, other than the invisible hand of the market forces?
Yeah,
even during the Great Depression of last century, in the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt turned to intervention with the market, right? It's called the New Deal of FDR. Why can't China do the same?
Well, I don't think anyone's saying China can't do it. I noticed, very interestingly, one of the four cabinet ministers, I forget which one, when interviewed in Beijing, said that China has its own economic model. It seems to work for them. What we want, that is Americans, is just more market access, more openness. Very, very pragmatic, Trumpian, if you like, view of the world. I think we have to get ideology out of this discussion. The world's characterized by economies with all different degrees of state intervention. Some more so than China, some much less so. So state intervention per se is should not be the issue. It's the distortions that it might create through excessive subsidies and the impact of those subsidies on third countries through subsidized exports.
Well, obviously you have raised some points, controversial points, about our access to the market on each side across the aisle. For example, China really wants to enjoy equal and easy access to high technology. When the United States demands a suspension of government subsidies for the high technology, then the United States should first of all stop their budget for the military-industrial complex. This is really something controversial for the rest of the world to figure out. Time is running out. But I'm really interested in bringing Geoff back for further discussions about our industrial policies and what they mean for the future of the regional economy and dynamics in particular. Until then, goodbye.